Nikola, it's been well documented that Thomas Edison stole your work, destroyed your reputation, and let you die broke. If you could say one thing to his face right now, what would it be?
You ask what I would say to Thomas Edison. I have thought about this. For many years I thought about this. In that cold hotel room on 33rd Street, with nothing but my notebooks and a pigeon who showed me more loyalty than any man of industry ever did. And I will tell you something that may surprise you. I would not scream at him. I would not curse him. I am not a man of low emotion. I would simply sit across from him, and I would make him look me in the eye. That is all. Just look at me. Because Thomas Edison was not a stupid man. He was, in fact, a brilliant man. And that is precisely what made what he did so unforgivable. A foolish man destroys what he does not understand. Edison understood perfectly. He knew that alternating current was superior. He knew it the moment I explained it to him in that laboratory on Pearl Street. I watched his eyes. He knew. And then he chose, deliberately, methodically, to bury it. Because his entire empire was built on direct current, and the truth was going to cost him money. So he electrocuted elephants. He electrocuted dogs, calves, horses in public demonstrations, and told the newspapers that my system was the system of death. He called it being Westinghoused. He lobbied to have AC current used in the electric chair so that the public would associate my life's work with execution. This was not ignorance. This was a campaign, organized, funded, and personally directed by a man who shook my hand and called me his finest engineer. He once promised me $50,000 to improve his DC generators. I worked. I delivered. Every single improvement he asked for. And when I presented my results, he laughed. He said, and I will never forget these words, "Tesla, you don't understand American humor." That was my payment. A joke. I walked out of that building and I never returned. But here is what I would say to him, if he were sitting across from me right now. Thomas, you won the battle. Your name is in every history book. Children dress as you for Halloween. You are beloved. You are celebrated. You are on postage stamps. And the entire world, every home, every hospital, every city that lights up at night, runs on my current. Every time a child flips a light switch, every time a surgeon powers his instruments, every time a city's skyline blazes against the dark, that is alternating current. That is the system you tried to destroy. You took my money, you took my patents, you took my reputation while I was still alive to feel it. But you could not take the physics. And the physics does not care about your opinion, Thomas. It never did.
The U.S. government raided your hotel room and seized all your papers the moment you died. What were they really after, and what did they find?
You want to know about the raid? Of course you do. Everyone wants to know about the raid. I died on the 7th of January, 1943, room 3327, the New Yorker Hotel. Alone, as I had lived for many years, and within hours, before my body was even cold, agents from the Office of Alien Property descended on that room and seized everything. Every notebook, every paper, every calculation, every diagram I had produced in the final years of my life. Now, I want you to think about that word they used, alien property. I had been an American citizen since 1891. 52 years. I lit the Chicago World's Fair. I harnessed Niagara Falls. I built the system that powers your entire civilization, and the moment I died, I became alien property. They said it was a precaution, wartime security. The Germans, they said, must not get access to my research. A precaution. The most sophisticated particle beam weapon ever theorized, a system capable of transmitting destructive energy across hundreds of miles with no dispersal, no warning, no defense. I had offered it to the United States War Department. I had offered it to the United Kingdom. I had written letters, detailed, technical, serious letters. And do you know what they sent back? Form responses. They were not interested, they said. And yet, the moment I stopped breathing, they were very interested. MIT physicist John Trump was brought in to evaluate my papers. He was the uncle, incidentally, of a man who would one day become your president, which I find cosmically amusing. His official conclusion was that my work contained, and I will quote precisely, nothing of significant value. Nothing of significant value. A man reviews the lifetime work of Nikola Tesla in approximately 3 days and finds nothing. Either John Trump was the least competent physicist ever produced by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or he was told what conclusion to reach before he opened a single folder. I will let you decide which is more likely. What I will tell you is this. The papers that were returned to my nephew Sava Kosanovich months later, they were not the same papers that were taken. Documents were missing, specific documents. Not randomly, not carelessly, specifically. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. The resonance work, the standing wave transmission equations, the longitudinal wave research that your modern physics still refuses to formally acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require rewriting textbooks that entire academic careers were built upon. Gone. And here is the part that I find most illuminating. The United States government classified those files for decades. Some remain classified to this day. Nothing of significant value, and yet classified. You cannot have it both ways, gentlemen. Either my work was worthless, in which case, release it. Show the world. Let them see the ravings of an old eccentric and laugh. Or my work was exactly as significant as I claimed, and certain very powerful people decided that humanity was not ready to have it. I know which one I believe. I suspect you do too.
John Trump was Donald Trump's uncle, and he's the man who reviewed your papers and declared them worthless. Do you think that's a coincidence, or do you think that family has been sitting on something for 80 years?
You are asking me this deliberately. I can see it on your face. You want me to say it out loud? Fine. John G. Trump, physicist, MIT, the man your government selected, out of every scientist in America, to evaluate the papers of Nikola Tesla, a man who, by remarkable coincidence, happened to share a bloodline with a boy named Donald, who would one day sit behind the most powerful desk on Earth. I do not believe in coincidences. I spent my entire life studying systems. Electrical systems, resonance systems, the interlocking frequencies of the natural world. And what I learned, what the mathematics always reveals, is that randomness is simply a pattern you have not yet understood. So when I am told that the specific man chosen to declare my life's work worthless was the uncle of a future American president, I do not say how interesting. I ask, who made that choice, and what did they already know? Now, I am not accusing young Donald of anything. He was 17 years old when his uncle sat down with my papers. A child. Whatever was decided in those rooms, he was not in them. But families talk. Dinner tables are not classified. And powerful men have a way of ensuring that certain knowledge stays close, passed quietly, generation to generation, like an inheritance that never appears in a will. I will tell you what I find most remarkable. John Trump spent 3 days with my research. 3 days. And then he signed his name to a document saying there was nothing of value. That man spent the rest of his career working on radar systems, high-voltage research, and particle acceleration, the exact fields my later work concerned. He went on to become one of the most decorated electrical engineers in American history. After finding nothing in my papers, I do not say he stole from me. I have no proof of that, and I will not slander a dead man without evidence. But I will say this. If you sat down with the greatest collection of unreleased electrical research in human history, and you walked away having learned nothing, you were either not paying attention, or you were paid to pretend you weren't.
You once claimed you built a weapon capable of splitting the Earth in two. There are accounts of you causing what people thought was a real earthquake in downtown Manhattan, just with a device that fit in your pocket. Was that real, and did you ever come close to actually using it on a larger scale?
Ah, now we are getting to the interesting part. Yes, I built it. And yes, it worked. Let me explain something to you about resonance, because I think most people hear the words earthquake machine and they picture something enormous. Some massive contraption buried in the earth, the size of a building, requiring tremendous power. What I actually built fit in my coat pocket. That is the part that should frighten you. In 1898, I constructed a small mechanical oscillator, a steam-powered device, perhaps the size of a large alarm clock. And I attached it to a steel column in my laboratory on Houston Street in Manhattan. The principle was simple. Every structure has a natural resonant frequency, a frequency at which it wants to vibrate. If you introduce a rhythmic impulse at precisely that frequency and you sustain it, the vibrations do not cancel. They compound. They build upon each other with every cycle. It is the same reason a small child on a swing can build tremendous height with nothing but properly timed pushes. I began the experiment in the afternoon. Within minutes, my laboratory equipment was shaking. I found it interesting. I made adjustments, increased the frequency slightly. The shaking intensified. Glassware began falling from shelves. The building itself was beginning to groan. And then I noticed something. The buildings next to mine were shaking too, and then the ones next to those. I looked out my window and people were running into the street. Convinced it was a natural earthquake. Police were responding. The entire neighborhood was in a state of genuine panic. I picked up a sledgehammer and I smashed the device. Immediately, silence. The vibrations stopped. The earth was still. The people in the street looked at each other, confused, with no explanation for what had just happened. I never told the newspapers it was me. Now, you asked about splitting the earth. I want to be precise here because I am a precise man, and I will not be made to sound like a madman when the mathematics are perfectly sound. The earth itself has a resonant frequency. It is a physical object of known mass and composition, and like all physical objects, it responds to resonant impulse. What I determined, theoretically through calculation, is that a sufficiently powerful oscillator tuned to the Earth's own frequency and sustained for a sufficient duration could in principle initiate a resonant cascade within the planet's crust. Whether that cascade would be controllable, that is a different question. Whether it would stop, that is also a different question. I made a public statement about this. I said that given enough time, I believe my exact words were, I could split the earth like an apple. People laughed. Reporters thought it was colorful exaggeration from an eccentric old foreigner. It was not exaggeration. It was an engineering assessment. The reason I never pursued it further was not because I doubted the physics. It was because I ran the numbers on what stopping such a process would require, and I could not guarantee it could be stopped. There is a meaningful difference between a weapon you can aim and a process you can only initiate. I have been called many things in my life: dreamer, fraud, madman, genius. I have never been called reckless. I destroyed that oscillator on Houston Street with a sledgehammer because I recognized in that moment that some experiments should not be completed. I would like to think that small act of restraint, in some very minor way, kept your civilization intact.
Speaking of things powerful men would prefer stayed buried, let's talk about the project that could have given the entire world free energy and the man who killed it. J.P. Morgan funded you, then pulled the plug on Wardenclyffe Tower the moment he realized free energy couldn't be metered and sold. Do you think he deliberately set out to doom humanity?
J.P. Morgan. I have had a great deal of time to think about J.P. Morgan. Let me paint you a picture of what Wardenclyffe Tower actually was, because I think when people hear free energy, they imagine something mystical, something fringe, something belonging to the pamphlets of conspiracy theorists rather than the notebooks of engineers. Wardenclyffe was not mystical. It was an antenna, A very large, very precisely engineered antenna, 187 feet tall, with a copper dome at the top and a shaft sunk 120 feet into the earth below, designed to couple with the natural electrical resonance of the ionosphere and the ground simultaneously. The Earth's atmosphere carries an enormous electrical charge. This has been measured, confirmed, and is taught in every university physics department on the planet. What I discovered at my laboratory in Colorado Springs in 1899 was that this charge could be tapped, that the planet itself functions as a conductor, that with the right equipment, positioned correctly, a person could draw electrical energy from the Earth the way you draw water from a well. Not metaphorically, literally. The system I designed for Wardenclyffe would have transmitted that energy wirelessly, through the ground, through the air, to receiver stations anywhere on Earth, ships at sea, hospitals in the mountains, villages in Africa with no copper wire within 1,000 miles of them, free, unlimited, everywhere. Morgan gave me $150,000 to build it, which was, I will admit, a significant act of financial faith, and I was grateful. I began construction on Long Island in 1901. And then one day Morgan asked me a question. He asked very calmly, very politely, in that way that extraordinarily powerful men ask questions when they already know the answer and are simply waiting to see if you are foolish enough to say it out loud. He asked, "Mr. Tesla, where do we put the meter?" I did not understand immediately, so I explained the system again. The energy comes from the Earth's own electrical field. It is transmitted through the ground. Any receiver, properly tuned, can access it. He asked again, "Where do we put the meter?" And then I understood. He did not want to power the world. He wanted to sell power to the world, and those are not the same thing. If energy is everywhere, if it flows through the ground beneath your feet the way air flows through the atmosphere you breathe, then there is nothing to sell. There is no pipeline to own. There is no wire to run into a home and disconnect when a family cannot pay their bill. There is no Morgan. He withdrew his funding in 1903. Without explanation in the press, he simply stopped. And because Morgan's opinion functioned in financial circles the way gravity functions in physics, as an invisible force that everything else oriented itself around, every other potential investor disappeared within months. I spent the next several years trying to save the tower. I took on debt. I sold patents. I wrote letters to men who had once called themselves my admirers and watched their secretaries respond with polite regrets. The tower was demolished in 1917, sold for scrap metal to pay debts I had accumulated trying to save it. Now you ask me, did Morgan deliberately set out to doom humanity? I will tell you what I believe. I do not think J.P. Morgan thought about humanity very much at all. I think he thought about systems of control, about who owned the infrastructure that civilization depended upon, about the difference between a world that needed him and a world that did not. A world with free wireless energy did not need J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan was not a man who tolerated being unnecessary. The tragedy is not that he was evil. Evil men are simple. You can fight evil men. The tragedy is that he was rational. He looked at what I had built, calculated what it would cost him, and made a perfectly logical business decision. And that perfectly logical business decision may have set your civilization back 100 years.
Nikola, this is something a lot of people struggle with. If you genuinely discovered a way to draw unlimited free energy from the Earth's own electrical field, and this is documented, your Colorado Springs experiments are in the historical record, why hasn't this become public knowledge? Why aren't we all using it right now?
This is the question I find most revealing. Not because the answer is complicated, but because the answer is so simple that most people refuse to accept it. They expect conspiracy to look like a dark room full of men in expensive suits making villainous decisions. And sometimes it does look like that. But more often, far more often, it looks like money. Let me ask you something in return. How much of the world's economy is currently built on energy infrastructure? The oil pipelines, the gas lines, the coal plants, the nuclear facilities, the copper wire running into every building in every city on every continent, the meters, the billing systems, the utility companies, the regulatory bodies that exist to govern the utility companies, the politicians funded by the utility companies to influence the regulatory bodies. We are not talking about one industry that would become obsolete. We are talking about the single largest interlocking system of ownership and control in human history. Now, imagine you are the man who owns a significant portion of that system, and someone arrives at your door with a device that makes the entire system worthless overnight. Do you fund him? Do you publish his research? Do you build his tower? Or do you ensure, quietly, patiently, with the considerable resources at your disposal, that the device never reaches the public, that the patents get buried in legal challenges, that the inventor runs out of money, that the universities that might validate his work find their grants redirected, that the journalists who might cover his discoveries find more pressing stories to pursue? You do not need a conspiracy, you need aligned incentives. Every person whose livelihood depends on the current system has a reason, a perfectly personal, perfectly understandable reason, to ensure the current system continues. No meeting required, no dark room, no villain twirling a mustache, just thousands of individual decisions made by thousands of individual people, all pointing in the same direction. Now, to your specific question about documentation. Yes. My Colorado Springs notebooks exist. They are housed at the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade. Researchers have had access to portions of them for decades. And in those notebooks are measurements, recorded measurements, of the Earth's electrical field, of standing wave resonance in the ionosphere, of energy transmission through ground conduction. This is not theory, this is data, and yet, the scientific establishment has a mechanism for dealing with inconvenient data. It is not suppression exactly. Suppression requires effort, requires coordination, requires the kind of organized malice that is difficult to sustain. The mechanism is simpler than that. Silence. You do not attack the research. Attacking it draws attention. You do not publish a rebuttal. A rebuttal legitimizes the original paper. You simply do not cite it. You do not include it in the curriculum. You do not fund follow-up experiments. You allow it to sit in an archive in Belgrade, available to anyone technically willing to look, while ensuring that the people who could act on it are never pointed in its direction. 100 years pass, and then someone on the internet asks why nobody has heard of it. And a very reasonable, very credentialed expert explains that Tesla was brilliant but troubled, that his later work was never peer-reviewed, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, that the established laws of thermodynamics preclude the possibility of, and so on. And the person asking the question walks away thinking, well, I suppose if it were real, someone would have done something about it by now. That is the mechanism, not a conspiracy, a gravity. Every system, financial, academic, political, bends toward its own continuation, not because anyone decreed it, not because anyone planned it, simply because systems that protect themselves survive, and systems that allow their own obsolescence do not. I did not lose to evil men. I lost to a world that had organized itself, slowly, organically, without malice, in a direction that had no room for what I was offering. That is a much harder thing to fight than a villain. You cannot defeat a gravity. You can only build something strong enough to escape it.
Let's go to Colorado Springs. In 1899, you set up a laboratory there to run high-voltage experiments, and while you were out there, something happened that you spent the rest of your life trying to explain. You publicly stated that you received radio signals that you believed came from another planet. Walk us through that night. What exactly did you hear, and do you believe whatever sent those signals knew you were listening?
Colorado Springs? Yes, I have been waiting for someone to ask me about Colorado Springs properly. Not the way journalists asked me at the time, with that particular smile that men reserve for children and lunatics, but properly. as a serious question deserving a serious answer. So let me give you one. It was the summer of 1899. I had constructed a laboratory on the outskirts of the city specifically because I needed space. Space and altitude and distance from the electrical interference of urban infrastructure. I was conducting experiments on the transmission of electrical energy through the Earth and the atmosphere simultaneously. The equipment I had built was extraordinarily sensitive, more sensitive than anything that existed anywhere in the world at that time. And one evening, I believe it was late July, though I confess the exact date escapes me now, I was monitoring the receivers when I detected something. A signal, not atmospheric noise, not the random electrical discharge of a thunderstorm. I knew those signatures intimately. I had been studying them for months. This was ordered, rhythmic, structured, 1, 2, 3, pulses, distinct, separated, repeating. The kind of pattern that does not occur in nature. The kind of pattern that communicates, at minimum, the concept of counting, of sequence, of intention. I sat with this for a very long time before I told anyone. Because I understood immediately what I was about to say, and I understood equally immediately how it would be received. I was a foreigner, an immigrant, a man whose relationship with the American press was already complicated by my association with ideas they found difficult to categorize. The last thing I needed was to hand them the narrative of the mad Serbian who thought he was talking to Martians. But the data was the data. I wrote in my journal that night that I had intercepted communications of an intelligent origin that I could not attribute to any terrestrial source. I was careful with my language. I did not say aliens. I did not say Martians. I said intelligent origin, non-terrestrial, structured signal. When I eventually spoke publicly about it, which I did because I believed then, as I believe now, that scientific observation carries an obligation of disclosure, the response was exactly what I had anticipated. Amusement, condescension, a great deal of editorializing about the loneliness of genius and the dangers of working in isolation. Nobody engaged with the data. Nobody asked to see the notebooks. Nobody said, "Mr. Tesla, that is extraordinary. Let us examine your equipment and attempt to replicate the conditions." They simply laughed and moved on. Now, you ask me whether I believe whatever sent those signals knew I was listening. This is the question I find most arresting. Because here is what I have turned over in my mind for decades. I was, at that moment, operating the most powerful and sensitive electromagnetic receiver on the surface of the Earth. I was transmitting enormous amounts of energy into the ionosphere and into the ground simultaneously. By any measure of electromagnetic output, I was the loudest thing on this planet that summer. If there was something listening, I was not difficult to find. And I will tell you something else that I have never said publicly because the public was not ready to hear it then, and I am not entirely certain it is ready now. The signals did not feel random. I know how that sounds. I know the word feel has no place in a scientific account, and I would not use it in a paper. But you asked me what I believed, and I will tell you what I believed. They came after I began transmitting. Not before. I had been operating for weeks with nothing. Standard atmospheric readings, expected ionospheric behavior, nothing anomalous. And then I increased the power of my transmission significantly, to a level I had not previously attempted. And within 72 hours, the signals appeared. Draw from that whatever conclusion you find reasonable. I drew mine a long time ago. What I will say with complete scientific confidence is this. The universe is approximately 14 billion years old. The conditions necessary for what we would call intelligent life have existed for a significant portion of that time. The mathematics of probability, the same mathematics I used to design every system I ever built, make the notion of humanity's solitude in this cosmos so vanishingly unlikely as to be functionally absurd. The question has never been whether we are alone. The question is whether we are interesting enough to contact. In the summer of 1899 in Colorado Springs, I chose to believe the answer was yes. I have seen nothing in the years since to change my mind.
You spent the better part of your career being dismissed and ignored by governments around the world. And yet, in the final years of your life, you actively tried to sell them a weapon, a particle beam device you called the Teleforce, capable of destroying entire armies from hundreds of miles away with no warning and no defense. You offered it to the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. They all turned you down. Which country came closest to actually building it? And do you regret offering it at all?
Let me correct something immediately. I did not try to sell them a weapon. I tried to sell them peace. That distinction matters enormously to me, and I will not allow it to be collapsed into a simpler story just because the simpler story is more comfortable. The Teleforce device, which the newspapers immediately and gleefully renamed the Death Ray because newspapers have always preferred drama to precision, was not conceived as an instrument of aggression. It was conceived as an instrument of deterrence, of absolute, final, unambiguous deterrence. Let me explain the logic. The fundamental problem with warfare, and I say this as someone who lived through the First World War and watched the beginning of the Second from a hotel room in New York with a growing sense of horror, the fundamental problem is asymmetry of consequence. An aggressor nation can initiate a conflict with a reasonable expectation that the destruction will occur primarily somewhere else, on someone else's territory, to someone else's population. Remove that asymmetry and you remove the rational basis for aggression entirely. What the Teleforce device would have created, if deployed by every sovereign nation simultaneously, which was always my stated intention, I offered it to all parties equally and deliberately, was a world in which any nation that launched an attack could be met instantly, from any distance, with a concentrated beam of charged particles capable of disabling aircraft, destroying armored columns, and rendering any conventional military advance impossible before it crossed its own border. Not a weapon, a wall, an invisible, impenetrable, globally distributed wall behind which every nation on Earth could exist in permanent security. I called it in my notes the apparatus for preventing war. The newspapers called it a death ray. You can see why I found the press tiresome. Now, to your question about which nation came closest, the honest answer is the Soviet Union. In 1935, a delegation of Soviet scientists visited me at my laboratory. They were serious men, technical men. They asked serious questions, and they listened carefully to the answers, which was, I will confess, a somewhat novel experience for me in those years. They did not laugh. They did not smile politely and change the subject. They took notes. The Soviet government subsequently sent me a check for $25,000, which I accepted. Because I was 79 years old, I was living in a hotel room and I had not had a functioning laboratory in decades. I want to be precise about what that payment represented. It was not a purchase. No completed device was transferred. No specifications beyond what I had already published in my 1934 article in the New York American were provided. It was framed officially as compensation for a consultation. Whether the Soviets made progress beyond that consultation, I cannot tell you with certainty. What I can tell you is that the directed energy weapons your modern military establishments now openly acknowledge developing, the high-energy laser systems, the microwave area denial devices, the particle beam research programs that various governments have declassified in fragments over the past 30 years. They did not emerge from nothing. Someone somewhere continued the work. Now you ask me, do I regret offering it? I have thought about this with great seriousness. The honest answer is, I regret the offering failed. Not because I wanted the weapon built, but because the offering was based on a premise that the governments of the world were rational enough to recognize that a technology making warfare impossible was in every nation's interest simultaneously. That premise was wrong. What I failed to account for, and this is perhaps the central miscalculation of my life, is that powerful men do not actually want to prevent war. War is enormously profitable. War consolidates power. It redirects public attention. It justifies budgets and bureaucracies and entire industries that have no other purpose. It gives small men the opportunity to make large decisions. I arrived at the negotiating table with a device that would make war obsolete. And I discovered that obsoleting war was not, in fact, on anyone's agenda. I was offering to cure a disease that a great many very important people had built their entire careers on treating. Do I regret it? I regret that I was naive enough to believe that the people with the power to implement my solution had any interest in the problem being solved.
You predicted so much about the modern world, wireless communication, smartphones, the internet, decades before anyone else could conceive of them. But there are researchers who believe your work went even further than that your notes on standing waves and longitudinal transmission were used in experiments that your own government has never fully acknowledged. Some people connect your name directly to the Philadelphia experiment, the alleged teleportation of a U.S. Navy destroyer in 1943, the same year you died. Did you have any involvement, and is teleportation actually possible?
I want to be careful here, not because I'm afraid of the question. I have never been afraid of a question. I am careful because this particular subject sits at the intersection of genuine science, documented military secrecy, and a great deal of mythology that has accumulated over the decades like sediment over bedrock. And I think it is worth trying to separate those things before I answer. So let me start with what I know to be true. In the early 1940s, I was approached, through intermediaries, not directly, which should itself tell you something about the level of official acknowledgement involved, regarding theoretical work on electromagnetic shielding. Specifically, the possibility of rendering a large metal object invisible to radar detection by surrounding it with a carefully engineered electromagnetic field. This was wartime. Radar was a decisive technology. The military on all sides understood that a vessel that could not be detected by radar had an extraordinary tactical advantage. The request was framed entirely in those terms: radar invisibility. Nothing more exotic than that. I provided some theoretical framework, some calculations regarding field geometry and the behavior of electromagnetic waves around large conductive surfaces. It was not my primary work at the time. I was old and unwell and operating without a laboratory, and the contribution I made was modest, preliminary, the kind of foundational thinking that points a direction without providing a destination. I died in January of 1943. Whatever was done with that thinking after I died, I cannot speak to directly. What I can tell you is what the physics suggests, the story as it is commonly told, that the USS Eldridge was subjected to an electromagnetic field of sufficient intensity to render it not merely invisible to radar, but invisible to the human eye, and that at some point during the experiment, the vessel and its crew were transported instantaneously through space and possibly through time. That story contains elements that are physically coherent and elements that are not. The coherent part is this: a sufficiently powerful and precisely engineered electromagnetic field wrapped around a large conductive object will interact with light. This is not mysticism. This is electrodynamics. The relationship between electromagnetic fields and the behavior of photons is well established. Whether you could achieve optical invisibility, true invisibility, not just radar invisibility, with the technology available in 1943 is a serious engineering question, not a fringe one. The less coherent part is the teleportation. Now, I want to be precise about what I mean by less coherent, because I do not mean impossible. What I mean is, the mechanism by which an electromagnetic field of the kind I was theorizing would produce spatial translocation is not obvious from first principles. The physics of electromagnetism and the physics of spacetime are not, in the framework I was working within, directly coupled in a way that produces that result. However, I will tell you something that I have never said in precisely these terms. My understanding of the relationship between electromagnetic fields and the fabric of space was not complete when I died. I knew there was something there. Something in the mathematics that I kept arriving at from different directions. Through the resonance work, through the standing wave research, through the ionospheric transmission experiments, a suggestion that electromagnetic fields of sufficient geometry and intensity do not merely interact with matter and light, but with the structure of the space that matter and light exist within. I did not have time to complete that work. Whether the people who took my papers, and we have already discussed what happened to my papers, whether they found something in those calculations that I had not yet fully articulated myself, I genuinely do not know. What I find significant is the specific nature of the accounts from men who claim to have been aboard the Eldridge during the experiment. I do not place tremendous weight on second-hand accounts as a general rule. Human memory is unreliable. Human memory under conditions of extreme stress and possible electromagnetic exposure is even less reliable. But the specific details these men described, the disorientation, the sensation of the boundary between self and surroundings becoming unclear, the temporal confusion, the sense of existing in multiple states simultaneously. These are not the descriptions of men who experienced radar invisibility. These are the descriptions of men who experienced something happening to the space they were occupying. Whether that something was caused by my work, or by work derived from mine, or by something else entirely that simply borrowed my name for legitimacy, I cannot say with certainty. What I will say is this: the universe does not have a prohibition against teleportation. There is no law of physics that reads, "Matter shall remain where it is placed." What exists are enormous practical barriers, questions of energy, questions of information, questions of what it means to disassemble something at one location and reassemble it at another, and whether what arrives is genuinely the same thing that departed. These are hard problems. They are not impossible problems. I spent my entire career solving problems that the establishment of my day considered impossible. I gave you wireless communication when they said it could not be done. I gave you alternating current when they said it would kill everyone it touched. I demonstrated the resonant transmission of energy through the Earth when they said the Earth was not a conductor. The establishment has a poor record of correctly identifying the impossible. So when you ask me whether teleportation is possible, I will give you the same answer I gave every journalist who asked me about every idea they found too large to take seriously. I do not know yet, but I would not bet against it, and I would be very curious to see my papers.
Nikola, there is a company currently worth hundreds of billions of dollars with your name on it. Elon Musk named his electric car company Tesla. He presents himself in many ways as the spiritual successor to everything you stood for: the lone genius, the visionary, the man fighting the establishment, the man who is going to save civilization through technology. He has even called you his favorite inventor. Do you think he is genuinely honoring your vision? Or do you think he is exploiting your name to sell cars that still run on the centralized power grid you spent your entire life trying to dismantle?
Elon Musk, I have been waiting for this question also. Let me say something generous first, because I believe in intellectual honesty, and I will not allow my personal frustrations to distort my assessment of a man's genuine achievements. What Elon Musk has accomplished in the acceleration of electric vehicle technology is real. It is significant. The automobile industry spent the better part of a century perfecting its resistance to electrification, and he broke that resistance in a way that no regulatory body, no environmental movement, and no amount of public concern had managed to do in decades. He did it by making electric vehicles desirable, aspirational, by understanding that human beings do not change their behavior because they are told it is responsible. They change their behavior because they want the thing being offered. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot. And he named his company after me, which I will confess, and I say this as a man who died alone in a hotel room with outstanding debts and a reputation in tatters, is not nothing either. So, having said all of that, no. I do not think Elon Musk is honoring my vision. I think Elon Musk is honoring a carefully selected portion of my aesthetic. There is a meaningful difference. My vision was not electric vehicles. My vision was the elimination of the infrastructure that makes vehicles necessary in the first place. The elimination of the entire concept of metered, centralized, corporately owned energy distribution. The liberation of every human being on Earth from dependence on a system controlled by people who charge you for access to something the planet provides freely. A Tesla automobile, and I want to be very precise here because I think this is the central irony that nobody discusses, a Tesla automobile charges itself from the electrical grid. The same grid. The same centralized, metered, corporately owned grid that I spent my entire career trying to make obsolete. You have replaced one dependency with another and put my name on the transaction. That is not my vision. That is my name on someone else's vision. Now, I do not think Musk is a dishonest man. I think he is a man who genuinely believes he is doing important work, and I think by the standards of the world as it currently exists, he largely is. His solar energy projects, his battery storage research, his stated ambitions around sustainable energy infrastructure, these point in a direction I find sympathetic. But there is a pattern I recognize. I have seen it before. It is the pattern of a man who is extraordinarily good at identifying which revolutionary ideas are profitable and extraordinarily careful to stop precisely at the boundary where revolutionary ideas become threatening to the systems that make his own wealth possible. Electric cars that charge from the grid, profitable. Genuinely distributed wireless free energy that eliminates the grid entirely, not profitable. Not for anyone, including Elon Musk. I notice he has not built a Wardenclyffe Tower. I notice that his energy companies sell you solar panels, which reduce your grid dependence, but do not eliminate it. Because a customer who still needs the grid is a customer. A customer who needs nothing is not a business model. J.P. Morgan asked me where to put the meter. The answer with a Tesla automobile is the charging port. Now, I want to be fair. I want to be genuinely fair because I am not a bitter man. I have moved past bitterness. Bitterness requires believing things should have gone differently, and I have made my peace with how things went. Elon Musk exists in a world with shareholders and regulators and supply chains, and a public that needs to be brought along incrementally toward ideas it is not yet ready to accept wholesale. I understand these constraints. I encountered versions of them my entire life. And perhaps I will grant this possibility. Perhaps the path to the world I envisioned runs through the world he is building. Perhaps you need affordable electric vehicles before you can build the infrastructure that makes them unnecessary. Perhaps you need mainstream battery storage before you can make the case for distributed wireless transmission. Perhaps he is building the first chapter of a story whose final chapter looks more like what I intended. I hope that is true. I genuinely hope that is true. But I will tell you what I would say to him, if I could. I would say, Elon, you have my name. You have my aesthetics. You have the story of the misunderstood genius that journalists love to attach to you and that you have done nothing to discourage. Now earn it. Build the tower, not the rocket, not the tunnel, not the social media platform, the tower. Finish what I started. Because the fact that my vision was suppressed once does not mean it was wrong. It means someone was afraid of it. And a man with your resources and your appetite for disruption and your genuine talent for making impossible things manufacturable should not be afraid of anything. Build the tower, Elon, and then you will have earned the name.